Rome didn't fall. It was murdered. And the suspects are way stranger than anything your history teacher told you. This video is about the real theories behind Rome's collapse. And I'm not talking about the usual barbarians showed up in one story. That version is lazy. It skips the good stuff. Because the truth involves a general who was executed by the emperor he just saved, a volcanic eruption that erased summer for 150 years, and a chicken named Roma that might have changed the course of Western civilization. Most people think Rome fell because it got too big, went soft, and got overrun by outsiders. That's the comfortable version, the version that fits on a bumper sticker. But historians have actually cataloged 210 separate theories for why Rome collapsed, and some of them will completely rewire how you think about power, money, and collapse. We're going to cover the 7 most compelling ones today, starting with the one that makes me the angriest. Here's theory number 2. And yes, I'm starting with number 2 on purpose, because the best one is coming right after this. Rome was killed by climate change and a pandemic nobody can identify. In the 530s AD, a cluster of volcanic eruptions went off unlike anything the world had seen in thousands of years. We know this from ice cores and tree rings, not old books, actual physical evidence. Scientists call what followed the late antique Little Ice Age. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped sharply and stayed low for 150 years. Harvests failed, armies couldn't be fed, tax revenue collapsed. And this isn't in most Rome documentaries because it's a relatively recent discovery. Climate scientists found it, not historians. But here's where it gets worse. A study published in January 2024 in Science Advances reconstructed a high-resolution climate record for Roman Italy going back 800 years. It found something remarkable. 3 separate cold, dry periods aligned almost exactly with 3 separate catastrophic plagues: the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Cyprian, and the Plague of Justinian. Cold temperatures drove people off failing farms into crowded cities, and crowded cities are where diseases spread fastest. The Plague of Cyprian alone killed an estimated 5,000 people per day in Rome. 5,000. Every single day. For 15 years. It nearly destroyed the empire on its own. And here's the part that should keep you up at night. We still don't know what disease it was. Not smallpox, not bubonic plague. Possibly a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola. One of the deadliest pandemics in human history, and it remains completely unidentified. So, Rome was already bleeding out from the inside, weakened by climate, disease, and economic collapse, before a single barbarian army crossed a single border. But that's theory 2. Theory 1 is even more personal. Because it turns out Rome's greatest generals didn't just fail to save the empire. They actively helped destroy it. Stilicho was Rome's best military commander, half Vandal by birth, which matters in a second. He defeated the Visigoth leader Alaric twice, something no one else could do. He stripped troops from Hadrian's Wall and the Rhine frontier just to protect Italy. And in 408 AD, the emperor he was protecting, Honorius, had him arrested and beheaded based on court gossip. Within days of that execution, 30,000 of Stilicho's barbarian soldiers defected directly to Alaric. And then it got worse. Roman soldiers immediately turned on the wives and children of those 30,000 soldiers, men who had been serving in the Roman army. They massacred their families. That massacre, committed by Rome against its own allied troops' families, was the direct trigger for Alaric's march on the city. Rome wasn't sacked because the barbarians wanted to destroy it. They were retaliating for something Rome did first. 2 years after Stilicho's execution, Rome was sacked for the first time in 800 years. And the general who eventually stopped Attila the Hun? He spent years before that using Hunnic armies as personal mercenaries against his own Roman rivals. Flavius Aetius, celebrated as the last of the Romans, once committed outright treason by backing a usurper with Hunnic muscle. The man who saved Rome from Attila had spent decades using Attila's people to hollow out Rome's internal stability. Then, Emperor Valentinian III personally drew his sword and stabbed Aetius to death during a budget meeting. 3 years after Aetius had just saved the empire. A Roman historian wrote, "I do not know whether the emperor acted well or ill in slaying Aetius, but at least he cut off his right hand with his left. Valentinian himself was then assassinated 6 months later by Aetius's loyal soldiers. Rome's generals didn't just fail to stop the collapse, they were the collapse. That's important. But if you don't also understand the money side of this, you're missing half the picture. Theory 3 is the currency collapse nobody taught you in school. Rome's main coin, the denarius, started at roughly 90% silver. By the 260s AD, it had been debased so many times that it was basically a bronze coin with a thin silver wash, 2 to 5% silver content. Prices rose by 1,000% in a single century. Soldiers refused to accept payment in coins and demanded gold or actual goods instead. Merchants stopped trusting the currency. The entire trade network that fed Rome began to collapse. And this was happening before the barbarian invasions really got going. And it gets more staggering. Rome had the most sophisticated economy in the ancient world. Roman merchants used letters of credit, long-distance contracts, and financial instruments that wouldn't be seen again until the Italian Renaissance, a gap of nearly 1,000 years. When the Western Empire collapsed, this entire economic system just vanished. Regions reverted to barter. The economic dark age that followed was arguably more devastating than the political one. Part of what drained Rome's silver in the first place? Luxury goods. Roman writer Pliny the Elder complained that Rome was hemorrhaging 100 million sesterces per year to India and Arabia alone, for silk, spices, and gems. Rome produced almost nothing the East wanted in return. Centuries of trade deficits drained precious metals out of the empire and forced the currency debasement that eventually made the whole financial system unravel. Now here's theory 4, and this one might genuinely change how you think about history itself. Rome may have been destroyed by the historians who wrote about it. Scholar Alexander Demant cataloged 210 distinct theories for Rome's fall. 210. And when you look at them together, something fascinating emerges. Enlightenment historians blamed Christianity. Victorian historians blamed racial decline. Cold War historians blamed economic inequality. Every generation projects its own fears onto Rome. The fall has been used as a warning about immigration, socialism, decadence, and climate change, often by the same people, simultaneously. Edward Gibbon's famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire argued Christianity drained Rome's military spirit and diverted talent away from the state. It's one of the most influential historical arguments ever written. There's just one massive problem. The Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople was equally Christian, equally devout, and it outlasted the West by 977 years. Constantinople finally fell in 1453. If Christianity destroyed Rome, why did it preserve the Eastern Empire for nearly a millennium? And here's the thing about the barbarians who supposedly destroyed Rome. Alaric's Goths had been Roman soldiers, Christian converts, and imperial allies for a full generation before the 410 sack. Alaric himself had served as a Roman military officer. His Visigoths fought for Rome at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394. They considered themselves part of the Roman world. They wanted land and payment inside the empire, not its destruction. Rome wasn't torn apart by outside enemies. It was torn apart by insiders who had been promised a place at the table and then betrayed. The famous 410 sack itself? Historian Peter Heather described it as one of the most civilized sacks of a city ever witnessed. It lasted 3 days. Alaric ordered his troops to spare every Christian holy site. Refugees sheltering in the Basilica of St. Peter weren't touched. The psychological shock to the Roman world was enormous, but the physical damage was far less than its reputation suggests. And Attila the Hun, the most feared man in the ancient world, never actually sacked Rome at all. In 452, his army stood at the gates. Pope Leo I rode out personally to meet him. Attila turned around and left. The most famous destroyer of Rome never destroyed Rome. The Roman Senate, by the way, was still sitting and issuing decrees long after 476 AD, the date we call the Fall, operating under Germanic kings who kept Roman law, Latin administration, and the senatorial aristocracy intact. The people living through it mostly experienced it as a slow, bureaucratic handover, not a dramatic collapse. If you're finding this as mind-bending as I did when I first went down this rabbit hole, hit subscribe. We go deep on history, psychology, and the stories that got buried. Drop in the comments which theory hits hardest for you. The generals who betrayed each other, the climate science, or the idea that historians basically invented the fall of Rome. Because here's what all 7 theories point to when you zoom out. Rome didn't fall to a single enemy. It was weakened by climate and disease before anyone knew what was happening. It was bled dry by centuries of trade deficits and currency debasement. It was betrayed by its own greatest generals, murdered by the emperors those generals protected, and then handed off so gradually that the people living through it barely noticed. The fall, we learned about in school, the dramatic moment when civilization ended, is largely a story we told ourselves afterward. The real story is messier, stranger, and honestly, more terrifying. Because it doesn't look like an empire being conquered from the outside. It looks like a system slowly eating itself from within, while everyone in power made the problem worse trying to fix it. That's not ancient history. That's a warning.